Every voice matters. Blue Lift is a podcast dedicated to address the issues that affect all of us, with engaging discussions with progressive thought leaders and experts as guests. Here's your host, Peggy Kingsbury.
Welcome back to another episode of Blue Lift. And as always, we have a guest that I'm very excited about and someone who brings a wealth of knowledge to the table today. She's coming to us from the District of Columbia. So welcome to Blue Lift, Laura.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yeah. Laura was born and raised in Nashville and graduated from Brentwood High School, the University of Tennessee, and also from Middle Tennessee State University. What got you interested in politics, Laura? When did that start?
I think I was raised in a really Republican family. I'm the only progressive, or at least the only very outspoken progressive in my very large extended family. And I just was really raised with the idea that political conversation was a normal thing to have. I just grew up loving debating people. And after college, I moved to the DC area and started working in political media and realized sort of in the early 2010s, early 20-teens, that suddenly those conversations were getting more contentious and more emotional and eventually just impossible to have. And so my foray into academics was to study how the media has impacted our ability to relate to each other and the health of our society.
Well, how timely was that? My goodness. And I know, and I know that you also have done a lot of writing, and you've written for some big things like The Economist and Congressional Quarterly, as well as you've done some things for Politico, and you own your own communication firm now. I also know that you write some children's books and you love horseback riding. So that's kind of who Laura is, folks.
If you look up horse girl in the dictionary, it's just my picture.
That's you. So all your money goes to that. Every dime you have goes to the horses. What they eat, what they wear, what you wear. Yeah. What you tote them in. Yeah. I've got some my other business involves me having some clients who are also horse people, and I kind of know how that goes. So let's go ahead and just dive right in, because we are right now in a period of time, just so that the listeners know when this is being recorded. So this is being recorded the day after the horrible plane crash that just occurred in the Potomac there in the D.C. area. And we have seen some examples of how not to communicate to people, certainly on our televisions today or on our devices, whatever. I'm so old, I think everything's comes from a television. You're just lucky I don't still call it a tube. We used to call it the tube because it had a big old tube in it back in the day. Anyway, so let's just dive right in. And I want to talk a little bit about how the media does influence how we discuss politics. And I know that you're not old enough to have seen a lot of changes, but academically you've studied that issue. Just give me your thoughts on how things have changed about the way we do discuss things regarding politics.
So the biggest change over the last 15 years is the rise of the algorithm in dictating what kind of information that we encounter on a day-to-day basis.
So now explain to my listeners what an algorithm is.
An algorithm is, at the end of the day, just a little piece of math that filters all of the information out there in the world into the very narrow piece of information that reaches us. And I think it's an insane amount of media that is consumed every single day, or uploaded to the internet every single day. And so we actually have to have an algorithm to tell us what we want to consume. Sometimes that algorithm is just, I picked up the newspaper and it's the publisher of the newspaper who decided what is going into it today. Sometimes it's, a social networking platform like X, which has a propaganda intent. And is using that to dictate what serves you.
And so that we can sort of understand how this works, the algorithm is also, as I understand it, now able to be almost specific to me individually. They will tell not a class of people, not a zip code of people, but an individual is fed the information that this computer program decides must be either what I want to see, because trust me, if I search shoes, then I get shoe ads, right? And I get shoe videos, etc. So now it's heard me say that today. When I go home, I'll be buying shoes. But also then they can determine what the algorithm, and I say they, the people who write the code, can determine what they think I should be listening to, hearing, seeing, and reading about, correct?
Yeah, that's been true for at least a decade now. A great example for that is actually from the 2016 Republican primary. You've surely heard of the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal.
Yes.
So basically what was happening there is Cambridge Analytica was taking all of our Facebook data and crossing it with internet audience data that they had procured from other sources and used that to build an app. I think it was the Ted Cruz campaign that started using it, that you could, if you're just a person canvassing a neighborhood, you had an app, you could put the address in. The address would tell you who the person is, what policy topics they're most interested in, and what specific message you should say to them that is most likely to convince them. So every person you canvass could potentially hear something different. And that was a huge scandal in the 2016 election because it was a massive misuse of data and violated a bunch of privacy laws. But I think they have figured out different ways to continue to do that.
So they have, yeah, I think that's right. I think they have figured out ways to skirt those laws about privacy and whatnot and still feed us the information they think we need. And I know that there are ways that, for example, if I'm walking around the mall with my phone, then there are ways that these algorithms know kind of where I am and when they need to send me a certain message, which is disturbing and shocking. But what do you think, as a consumer of media, what is our responsibility in making sure that we're getting as close to the real information as possible? What's our responsibility? How do we deal with this?
It's hard because everything, especially right now, is changing really fast, and the platforms that all of us use a lot are changing really fast. And I think we each have a responsibility to focus on our media literacy skills, which is just like your ability to analyze where information comes from and how effective it is and how true it is. And that's just not a skill that a lot of people have. It's not taught in schools very much. And especially older generations that weren't raised with the internet have a lack of sort of innate ability to sort of pull out what is and is not true. I teach a class on this, if anyone is interested in taking it, on just how to recognize messages, what questions to ask yourself when you see something. And, I think the main takeaway that everyone should think about is the most dangerous messages that we encounter online in life are the things that we wish were true. So if you see a message and you wish that message was true, there are a whole bunch of psychological tricks that happen in our brain that make us predisposed to believing that thing, even if it's misinformation or straight up just false. And that's, I think, a huge problem.
Oh, wow. Now, that's a real good takeaway for all of us, is if when we hear something and we get excited about it, we can stop for just a second and say, am I believing this because I wish it was true?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I really like that. I like that, and we'll put a link to your class in the show notes that we'll get a little bit later. So let's just talk a little bit about the messaging that we're seeing in today's world, and I'm going to use a word that I know a lot of people don't even like to hear, but hey, it's a word and it's a real thing, and that's fascism.
Mm-hmm.
We're being fed messages now that seem so similar to what we've seen in the past with fascism that people like me, I'm scared. I'm scared that people are just believing, as you say, what they wish to be true. But then once enough people believe it, even if it's just because they wish it to be true, then it becomes at some point the truth to so many people. Speak to us about that.
Sure. I agree with you that fascism is happening. And I am with you in being scared of it. I'm also quite angry about it. Like it just feels very avoidable to me. But I'm also not in Tennessee. I'm in DC. And so part of my life now is I'm less surrounded by conservatives that are trying to gaslight me that everything happening is okay. And so my emotional state, I think, is a little bit better than it was the first time he was elected. The thing that Donald Trump and his teams, people like Stephen Miller, are really good at is propaganda. If you've studied Nazi Germany at all, propaganda is one of the biggest contributors that eventually led to the Holocaust. If you're ever in DC, there's a great exhibit on this at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. But what didn't exist in Nazi Germany that exists now is this algorithmic feeding of propaganda to people. So it's actually more potent now than it was in the 1930s and 40s, which is what makes it so scary to me. And Donald Trump has sort of created what I think of as a post-truth world. The way that he moves through the government and moves through the geopolitics is truth in his brain is whatever thing he needs to be true at that moment in time. And the actual truth, the physical truth of the statement doesn't matter to him. And, that makes it extremely difficult to discern what is real and what is not real when straight from the top, it's not a priority to them. And so that's pretty scary. And then you have oligarchs like Elon Musk who have, and Jeff Bezos, who have made really big investments in communication technology over the last 5 or so years. Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. We've kind of seen how that is going. And Elon Musk bought Twitter, renamed it X, which is just a really stupid name, just as an aside. And that platform has very quickly turned into just a really negative cesspool of right-wing talking points. And those sort of large billionaire acquisitions of media give billionaires just this outsized, insane amount of power over what we see and consume.
I agree. And having a criminal justice background, I tend to sort of always land there when I think about some of these issues. And when we're talking about X, I am still on X. I'm Cruise X, let's say. And sometimes I take my frustrations out and do post hit back at people. I try to be, well, I'm not going to say I try to be respectful. Sometimes I'm disrespectful, but they deserve it. Anywho, I think that one of the things I see is that any of these platforms, and I will say on the right or the left, that get people whipped into a frenzy. And really, at this point, it doesn't matter if the basis for what they're whipped up about is true or untrue, but generally it's untrue. And, this turns into real violence in today's world. People get whipped into a frenzy. They totally believe that something is true. And I am just so afraid that we're going to see more and more violence coming from these lies that people are believing about their fellow Americans.
I think that's true. unfortunately.
Yeah. And, so when I think about these things, I do sometimes think about them in really big, broad strokes. And then I also think about very specific things. And right now, the thing that's so hot in everybody's mind who's paying attention to any of this stuff is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I always ask people, which of those three don't you like? Do you not like diversity? Well, okay, then imagine going to the grocery store and all you get is vanilla ice cream to pick from. That's it. Do you not like equity? That just means that, things should be equal for people. So that means that you're okay with a large, let's say, government building where someone, I don't know, let's say they have to go in there to do their business. It's not accessible to someone in a wheelchair, and you're okay with that, which then comes to inclusion. So that means that, well, okay, you're all right with having a woman in a job, for example, but she doesn't have to be accepted by the rest of the team. And if the rest of the team wants to have a, golf, poker, cigar night, where everybody talks business, well, that's cool because she's not going to show up and we're not really concerned about including her in what we're doing. So I always ask people, well, which of those three is it you don't like, or is it you don't like all three of those? But this whole DEI thing is really, as a woman in my mid-60s, it's hard for me because I have seen how far we've come. I specifically, personally, have come a long way. My career has come a long way and taken advantage of the societal shift in letting women be in all spaces, and now I'm seeing that go backwards. And I cannot imagine how that must feel to my friends of color. It's got to be even a harder feeling for them. So I'm not crying white woman tears because that's, I realize that, that my quest is not nearly as difficult as theirs. So I think these little granular things stack up, right? They stack up if we take those in and we believe them too much. And you have spoken about, feeling like this time we're in, that is a big cultural shift. Talk to me about that.
Sure. I have so much to say about DEI just as a concept. I'll start with kind of my personal journey through from being a young Republican in my teens, going to Brentwood High School, spending, a lot of time. If you look at all the places I spent my time as a teenager, 50% of them were slave plantation houses. The country club, plantation house. My church had a plantation house. And just not ever being asked to really analyze what that meant in my life. And Brentwood, especially in the early 2000s, was a very white place. My high school was a very white place. And we just weren't challenged to broaden our minds about things. And I think what I find interesting about being from the South is I spend a lot of time with people in your generation, and you're in your 60s, which means you came of age during the civil rights movement in a time in the South where things were really contentious and racism was very obvious and very aggressive. And over the last 50 years, we've sort of learned, kind of Southerners and white Southerners in general have sort of learned that to be called racist is a bad thing, and kind of an insult. Don't call me that. But there's a lack a lot of times of actually doing the work to unpack what that means for the way that we were raised and the way that we think about the world. And look, DEI is an extension of white supremacy. It just is. A plane crashed in the Potomac River last night. The president and vice president gave a press conference early today. Before they even gave their sympathies to the families, they talked about, oh, this is a crisis caused by DEI. And what does that mean? Oh, that means there were Black people in the controller booth. Like, that's them trying to blame minority groups.
I agree.
Tragedy, right? And there's no way to separate those two things. Like, if you're against DEI, it stems from a place of white supremacy. And going back to what I was saying about propaganda, the actual phrase DEI has become a propaganda word that doesn't actually mean most of the time what people like what the technical definition is. So it's a very loaded word, and woke is another word that falls into this category.
Right.
We use it a lot. Republicans love to use the word woke. What does that word really functionally mean? In my experience, they sort of group all of the things they don't like under those two words to convince people to not like things, even if it doesn't have anything to do with DEI or being woke. The plane crash has nothing to do with DEI or being woke, but you call it DEI, you call it woke, and suddenly it gives people this emotional trigger to know that they're supposed to be mad about the thing. And Republicans do this a lot, where they take words and phrases and just sort of pile bad things underneath them and use that to manipulate people's emotional reactions to different things. So yeah, the transition into this new sort of cultural shift that we're having. I was getting my MBA at Vanderbilt during the pandemic. And, we had to take a class on DEI. We had to read the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And my class of 50, which had 11 women and 30 white men, and a few minorities, had to sit and have conversations about how to be an anti-racist. And Vanderbilt hosted that conversation for us and guided us through it. And now, all of a sudden, last 2 weeks, it's this politically toxic thing to study and talk about, to the point that if you talk about DEI, you're going to get fired, you're going to lose your funding. If you don't kowtow to this administration's sort of cultural shaping priorities, they want to kick you out of the government. And that is a huge 180 shift from where it was under the Biden administration or even a month ago.
I agree. And as with so many issues, it seems like we major on the minor and the extremes get all of the attention. I don't know anyone who wants to see someone who is unqualified for a job get that job just because of the color of their skin or their sex. No one wants that. And I will tell you, as a woman who has been in two careers where there were not many women before I showed up, right? And I know for a fact that my very first job out of college, I was given because I was a woman. However, actually, I was given the opportunity to apply because I was a woman. And in fact, the federal government had told the police department I was going to work for that, they were discriminating and they had to change it. They couldn't be a whole white male police force in a town that was very racially diverse. And so they saw that I was graduating with a degree in criminal justice, and they sent me a letter. And they could tell by my name I'm female. They sent me a letter. They asked me to apply. I did. I took all the testing. I scored very well. I passed all the physical exams, So I was qualified for the job. I would not have known about the job, nor would I have even bothered to apply had I not been reached out to by them. And, it's a very long story, and I won't take up your interview time with that. But in so many ways, my fellow officers, many of them much older white men, in so many ways, they came to understand and respect the need to have a woman on the force. First of all, I was a really good shot, so I could usually win all the trophies in shooting, and that was really nice. I didn't win them all, but I have some at home. And so that gave me some cred, let's say. But also, I just brought a diverse set of skills to the job. And I was younger, which helped. So I could talk to younger people. If frat boys misbehaved in Athens, Georgia, I kind of knew their language and what was afoot, When we went into domestic situations, I had unique skills where I could de-escalate something much better than the men because they just didn't have those skills at that time. They didn't really understand, the family dynamics like a woman would, for example. But I say all that to say that, of course, no one wants unqualified people in jobs. But when you talk about getting rid of DEI, like it seems that we are getting ready to do, just completely wipe it off the map in the U.S., I mean, people don't really understand what that means. What that means is the young disabled kid at Costco who checks you in and out probably won't have a job, because that's a job that DEI brought to this person who really needed a place to be and a job that he or she can do. It means that companies won't recruit at traditionally Black universities because that's a DEI effort. I mean, I'm not sure that people really understand what it means to say get rid of all DEI. Other than, I just be honest with you, Laura, my mind goes to the place where, yes, that's exactly what they want. And they just want all women at home having babies and cooking meals and cleaning house. And that's kind of how they want it. And they want every boardroom to be all white men. And I mean, you can look at pictures of boardrooms from the 50s and 60s and 70s and some 80s, and that's all you see. And I think that's the glory days they want us to go back to. And it's just it's hard to stomach it right now. Well, so let's talk about the other side of the communication. Let's talk about your helping us understand, how can we communicate best to hit back at some of this stuff? What do we do? How do we coalesce? We missed a lot of opportunities, but can we recover?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it's evolving. My sort of read on the current landscape of communication among Democrats is nobody was shocked that we lost in November, but I think everyone's kind of reevaluating who is in control of the messages that Democrats are communicating. I go back to the old saying that all politics is local. I think what you're doing with this podcast is fantastic. Finding pieces of local community where you can build friendships and alliances with each other is going to be super crucial. And then, I think it takes the brave people standing up and not being afraid to speak out against the fascist things that are happening, which is very scary to do. I know a lot of people who sort of secretly exist in progressive spaces, but are very afraid of their family finding out or of their community finding out. And so, it's got this sort of underground vibe to it. And that, I think people need to protect their mental health and, protect their peace in that way. But I think there's a real value in the brave people speaking out against it, even if they won't hear it. I mean, let's be real. Like, Marsha Blackburn is not going to listen.
No.
The super majority in the House is not going to listen.
No.
But there's the value in being a voice that stands up to them. And so one of the changes Facebook has made recently is they're shifting from a model where they were paying fact checkers to a model where they want the community to fact check things that are on Facebook. And so one thing people can do that it doesn't even really require you to stand up and be public about your ideas is, one, to stay on Facebook, not to cede that space to the right. I know that there's a temptation to do so, but to be consistent about when you see propaganda or misinformation in that news feed, to be the person that writes a report and sends it to Facebook, because they're moving to a fact check model where it's going to rely on us to do that. And that way you can fact check it and it doesn't have to be under your name. You don't actually have to say anything. So there's some ability to fight back in that way.
And I love that. I love that because you're right. I think that we all need to do what we can do, what we feel like we can safely do, and what suits us. And so for some, that might be doing some fact checking on Facebook. For others, it's calling your legislator or sending them an email. Now, are those always going to make a difference? Maybe not, but we've heard in the past that occasionally, especially in more of a state and local level, they'll say, I got so many emails about this issue, and I think that, my advice for people has been, look, if that's what you can do, if you can make a phone call and you can send an email, then do that. And then you have to let that go. In other words, I did what I could do. I'm not going to worry now about the outcome, nor am I going to feel like what I did was futile, but I did what I could do. Leave it on a positive path for yourself. And, and other people, as you said, are brave enough and I'm not saying that people who aren't brave. I don't want to, belittle anyone who's not willing to go, march, for example. But that's not for everybody, and I understand that. Mm-hmm. But I think that we have to support those people who are going to do those kinds of things.
Yeah, the pushback worked. There's a great example. It worked this week. If you haven't been following the it's a fire hose of breaking news this week. So if you missed this story, it's understandable. But on Monday night, the Office of Management and Budget put out a memo essentially freezing $3 trillion of federal money until they had a chance to review everything to make sure it wasn't funding DEI and climate change response are the two main things that they're looking for. And $3 trillion is a lot of money. Yeah. That is $2 trillion in the housing market is what crashed us in 2008. So to just wipe that much money out in 24 hours would have caused just an absolutely massive economic crisis. And I think the amount of people on Tuesday who were, panicking, I just took up my whole day on Tuesday, but who were calling the representatives, working their networks to see who they could get on the phone. I think that really impacted the day before yesterday. Was it yesterday? What is time? The White House rescinded that order and said, we're not going to do this anymore. Now, that doesn't mean they won't come for it in the future, but I think the pushback to it did work in the sense that it prevented our economy from just absolutely tanking overnight. And that's a pretty big victory in my book for the resistance.
Yeah, I agree. And it was a bit of bipartisan resistance, not across the board, because you did have one politician on one of the news stations saying that, kids don't need free lunch because they can get a job. And the interviewer said, well, but some kids are like 5 and 6 years old. Well, I had a newspaper route, and just ridiculousness. But I think, the bipartisan effort was an amazing thing to see. Even though the White House would not admit that, okay, it was a bad decision, we're taking it back. They had to, paint it as something else, but it was rescinded. And so that's a really good example. Do you think that when constituents call their representatives, it makes a difference what we say?
Not in Tennessee, I don't.
Yeah.
No.
You're probably right.
It does. I'm in Virginia, and I do believe that my voice when I do that has an impact here because it's the margin of victory on one side or the other is much smaller, and so they actually care. But I think the Republicans in Tennessee have been an unaccountable supermajority for so long that it doesn't matter what anybody thinks if you're not funding their campaign with millions of dollars.
So what do we do? So what do people in states like Tennessee and in Tennessee, what do we progressives do?
I think it's on the ground convincing people, one, that things are bad. I feel like I spend a lot of time talking to Tennesseans and trying to get across to them that things are actually pretty bad. And starting to build these grassroots campaigns from the ground up so that when election time comes, we can put Democratic candidates up that start to do better. A big piece of it is the Democratic Party as an establishment in the state of Tennessee has to do a better job of having a ground game and getting messaging across that connects to people and not ceding the political ground to the Republicans. And my experience with the Democrats in the state over the last 10 years has been just kind of an acceptance that this is the way that it is, and not enough of a fight to make change against it. And so there's ways to fight it. And I think people should still go through the process of writing a letter to your representative. What I do when I do that is I then send it as an op-ed to the newspaper, so that it's not just to my congressman, that it goes to anybody who might be interested in that topic. And then I think the other thing people can do to protect their mental health, one of Trump's propaganda tactics is something called flooding the zone, where it's a fire hose of just constant terrible things that are happening, and it's all at once. And so nobody has the mental energy or capacity to be responding to or angry about everything that's happening at the same time. So you get overwhelmed and your brain kind of shuts down, and you go to the barn and ride your horse and stop doing anything about it. One thing that's helped me in the last 10 years of my activism is choosing one or two issues that are really important to you. My two are climate change response, abortion rights, and to an extent, LGBTQ rights, and activating yourself around those issues and ignoring everything else that's happening, so that you are using your brain power to proactively engage with things that you care about, instead of just accepting the bombardment of all of it at the same time.
I love that. I love that advice. So now we've gotten two great tools to use. One is when we're listening to something and we so easily accept it, ask ourselves, is that because we wish it were true? And then two, pick our battles, and don't try to, drink from the fire hose. If if gun safety is something that's super important to you, dive all into that. If public education is the thing, dive all into that. I like that. Those are really good tools that we can use. So when we're watching the news, listening to the news, engaging with the news, how do we spot bias? How do we spot that? This is slanted, and maybe this is not the truth.
I love this question because it gets to the very center of what made me go to grad school. So at the practical level, there's no such thing as an unbiased source. It just does not exist. There's so much information in the world that there has to be some sort of bias directing the flow of information. Now, that bias in American media can most accurately be identified by looking at how that media organization makes its money. So in the United States, there's 4 main media business models. The first is advertising-based, which relies really heavily on algorithms. When an algorithm is determining the success of a piece of content, it necessarily has to invoke some sort of extreme emotion in the public, because that's what drives engagement, right? So the incentive for an advertising-based media company is create things that make you angry, create things that make you laugh, create things that make you feel heartwarmed, create things that make you scared, like these extreme emotions, right? So there's not really an incentive there to provide factual, quote unquote, non-biased information. And you can tell just by the amount of ads that are on a website. The next is, I'm going to say, public media. This is things like PBS and NPR that rely on government funding and sort of nonprofit funding to fund their operations. Those companies have a much better track record of providing really quality content because they're not chasing those extreme emotions. My caveat is that in a fascist society, state-run media eventually becomes a tool of the state. So that's something that I have my eyes on for those two, the NPR, PBS of the world, over the next 4 years, is what the Trump administration will do to those institutions. The third is the healthiest business model, which is subscription-based. So when you as a consumer are directly paying money to, say, the New York Times, then the New York Times has a vested financial interest in keeping your trust as a user, right? So the financial incentive is to support the people that read it. That was my master's thesis, actually. What we found is people that rely on subscription media for their news have much stronger community ties and are much less polarized in sort of their political discussion. And then the fourth business model is one that's really reared up over the last 10 years, which is this billionaire oligarchy model where billionaires are buying media companies. The expectation is not necessarily that that media company has to make a profit. The expectation is that the media company becomes a mouthpiece for the ideas of the billionaire. And so be very wary of billionaire-owned media. And if you're not sure, you can, most reputable companies at least, you can look at what their business is on Wikipedia, like you can Google it. So that's my first clue to people, is to look at what the business model is.
So when you get up in the morning, what are the news sources that you take in on the regular?
I'm a New York Times junkie. I think it's a great organization. It's not been without pitfalls over the last few years, but one thing I tell myself is, because I am biased to a certain progressive direction, if the media I'm consuming never pushes me or makes me angry or makes me ask questions or, makes me feel a little uncomfortable, then that piece of me, that media organization must be as biased as I am. So just having ideas, running ideas that are different than your own is not necessarily a reason to stop supporting an organization. So I love the New York Times. I listen to the Daily every day. And then I also really love Crooked Media, which is a really biased left-wing podcast network. It's a bunch of Obama guys. And they're kind of funny. They're really smart. And I think that there's room for a localized progressive media company to come in. I think there's a lot of hunger for progressive voices that don't seem like they're from the two corners, the two sides, the California, the DC, New York corridor, something like what you're doing, that's really speaking to local people in local places about how progressivism can help them. I think there's a big potential network there.
I agree. That's why I'm doing it. So thank you for that. So, you've given us another really good tip. Now that's a third really good tip, and that is, if the source that you're listening to, reading, never pricks you a little bit, then it may just be so biased that it's only feeding you what you wish you wish were true. And so I like that. So we've got these three really good tips you've left us with. Lastly, I just want to ask you about something that you sent to me. You said there really is no such thing as mainstream media. Talk to me about that.
Oh man, where to start? This is another topic I love to talk about. The quote unquote mainstream media in the 2020s is not real. That phrase really picked up steam in the 1990s when quote unquote mainstream media meant the cable news channels we all watched on TV. Like, you could really define a set of businesses that counted as the quote unquote mainstream media. Social media has taken over our news consumption, and that has really fragmented the information landscape. And I think for a while, people were trying to define mainstream media as one of the top, something owned by, the ABC, the Disney, the CBS, one of the big conglomerate companies. Now, the phrase mainstream media tends to be used to describe left-wing media, is what I find in sort of conversations that I have with people that's what they mean by it. But if you actually look at the top podcasts, the top cable news channel, the top websites, they're all right wing. It's the Daily Wire, it's the Ben Shapiro show, it's Joe Rogan, it's Fox News. So all of those things are very right leaning. And so if you're going to define in this decade what the mainstream media is, it actually would be right leaning media, but that's just not the way that it's used. And I tell you, nothing annoys me more than somebody complaining about an issue by blaming the media. It's a little bit like, I'm a Tennessee Vols fan, so a lot of heartbreaking sports in my life, and a Tennessee Titans fan. It's a little bit like losing a football game and running out being really mad at the refs. It's like, well, if you're a really good football team, you overcome the bad ref calls. So yeah, it's not real. It's another propaganda term that is really loaded and doesn't really have a tangible definition. And so anytime anybody's like talking to you about the mainstream media, my first question is always, how do you define what that is? Is it Politico? Is it the Washington Post? Is it the New York Times? Is it, the random podcaster or the random TikToker? Like what is the universe and sphere of what qualifies as mainstream media? And most of the time, there's not really a good answer to that question.
Right. And and in my age group, to me, mainstream media, always just meant ABC, CBS, NBC. And then when CNN came along, CNN, and then Fox News. And so I thought, well, okay, you got those five. And out of those five, that's kind of your mainstream media. Everything else is kind of this big slanted propaganda machine. But these five, they may have a little bit different slant on things, which is how it used to be. But you just pick out kind of which anchor you like the best, or are you a Jennings guy or Nora O'Donnell? Who do you like the best? Who do you want to get your news from? And that's not really where we are anymore. So yeah, and I see your kitty there. How sweet. But
working from home is
yes,
just real cat situation.
Well,
at all times.
And aren't you glad you're not a federal government employee enjoying working from home? Because apparently they've been told they have to come into the office now, or take a buyout, or get fired. So, what is the mood in D.C.?
The vibe is in shambles, honestly. And it kind of has been since Election Day. At this point, I more of my friends than not are in sort of a place of panic over what their job is in the future, and that goes beyond people who work for the federal government. I'm friends with a bunch of scientists at NIH that think their grants are going to get cut. I have a bunch of friends that are actually like planning to leave the country at this point. They're mostly in sort of minority groups that are targeted by the Trump administration. Yeah, everybody here is just sort of kind of walking around in a daze. The difference in how I talked about things between the post-2024 election and the post-2016 election are kind of crazy. 2016, I had a straight up nervous breakdown. I won't lie about it. Of just, what does this mean? And sort of everyone had this very raw, extreme emotional reaction to it. And I think the reaction in the weeks after the 2024 election was a lot of just people feeling really numb about it. There wasn't like a whole lot of conversation that happened. We all just kind of like made eye contact and was like, yeah, it's happening again. And I think at least until up between the election and inauguration, everybody kind of was like, okay, we're gonna have some fun and like breathe a bit so that we're ready to fight it when it starts. And now that it's here and it's happening, in a lot of ways, people are finding it's worse than they expected, which actually is consistent with my experience in 2016. And so that part of it's really scary. This he threatened to pull $3 trillion out of the economy on Monday. Like there doesn't seem to be an upper limit on how extreme he will try to be. And so I think the people in DC, who all, by the way, you know, I have a lot of friends in Tennessee who think that Washington, D.C. is kind of this lawless wasteland filled with homeless people and crime and gangs and graffiti and homeless people. And I think my experience of this city, I love this city, is that everyone I meet here, even people who grew up here and don't have like a quote unquote important job, have really interesting backgrounds and experiences. And the people that have moved here for work all have some really niche, kind of wonky reason to be here, which is just always so fascinating to ask people about. I mean, it could be, I'm interested in the school economics of Nigeria, right?
Right.
Like people have really niche things that they're so passionate about. And so, like people are here because they want to make the world a better place and not because they want to, sit on the government dime and not do any work and sort of exist in this lazy space. And it's disheartening that the conversation about it from outside of the Beltway is so pessimistic and negative about the people who work here. Because my experience is it's the exact opposite. It's people who work long hours for not enough pay, who really want to make a difference in their very specific area of the world. And I'm very afraid we're going to lose those people.
Right. And I agree totally. I mean, I have beloved family members who work for the federal government. One has devoted his career to making water safe for us, protecting our waterways so that we can get, fresh drinking water and fish will grow and all of that stuff. And the other who is fairly new in the career, but this is a young woman who actually did time in the Peace Corps. So this tells you where her heart is, right? And now her job is making sure that the food items that the federal government subsidizes and gets sent to schools all over the country are actually safe and inspected and nutritious and that sort of thing. So, very, very honorable jobs. But it sort of seems like, during COVID, they convinced us somehow that nurses and doctors were bad, Then they've tried to convince us.
And teachers are bad.
Yeah. Now
scientists are bad.
Yes. Now they've tried to convince us teachers are bad. And so now it's government workers. And I'm just really not sure what's going to be left other than apparently communication moguls who are oligarchs who, have 5 yachts. I don't know where this is headed, but it does kind of feel like we're picking on federal government employees, which I think is quite sad. And of course, I think that when people who are going along with all of this start to complain that they can't get the IRS on the phone, well, save your complaint. It's because you got rid of everybody. And, I think we forget how much the government actually does for us. And that's one of the purposes of the government is to serve its citizenry, not to amass money. All right. Well, this has been interesting. I want you to make sure you let us know if someone wants to take that course, to stay in touch with what you're doing. How can we get as much Laura Brown as we want in our lives?
Oh, thanks. That's a great question. I have a lot of different things. So I'm on Blue Sky, just laurabrown.bluesky.social. It's the first time in my whole life I've ever gotten my name as a username. So I'm very excited.
You got in early.
That.
Yeah, you got in early.
If anyone out there is interested in communication services, you can find me at Elm Communications, ELM Communications LLC.com. And then if you have a toddler or young kid in your life and you would like to buy them a personalized children's book, you can find me at firesidebooks.org. So yeah, those are my 3 primary projects.
And the course that you mentioned, that's accessible on your website, Elm Communications?
It is not yet, but we are going to have it up shortly.
Okay, awesome. And what's the theme of your children's books? Is there a theme?
Yeah, one of them is about outer space. You meet all the planets. And then the other one is a magical unicorn that takes you to the best national parks.
Oh, wow. Oh, I love both of those. Both of those.
Yeah.
That's awesome. All right. And we can, does your website have a link to those books or?
Yes.
Oh,
so
awesome.
That's firesidebooks.org. But all of my things I've interlinked.
Fabulous, because that's who you are.
We're just trying to build an ecosystem of, all of the different jobs that I have.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Laura, I really appreciate your time and expertise today. I love that what you bring to the table is deep education and knowledge about a topic. You also bring some youth to the table, and I think those are voices that we have to begin to listen to more and more, particularly my generation. And I do appreciate everything that you've said about political communication, and it's been on my mind and the minds of my like-minded friends that we let this happen. We're the frog in the boiling water who didn't realize how hot the water was getting. We let this happen. It's going to take a long time before we can get back to a place where we truly have some nonpartisan discussions and whatnot. But we have to start somewhere. And I always love to try to see if I can find something I have in common with someone who's on the other side. It's getting hard, but I think, we all love children, for example. We all want children to do well. And so that's kind of a springboard sometimes when I'm having conversations. But I will encourage people. Your host is going to take just a minute today to encourage you. Stay in the battle in the capacity that is most comfortable for you. If it's writing postcards, if it's making phone calls, if it's writing emails, do that. If it's giving money and you have treasure to give to those causes that support things you believe in. As Laura advised us, pick one or two things and dive all into those and do them with like-minded friends so that you feel a real sense of community. Because regardless of what we might hear coming from the mouths of some of these people, this was really not exactly a mandate. More people voted for someone other than Donald Trump than who voted for Donald Trump. Okay. But we do know that if you want to do the math on it, it would seem that, almost half of the people wanted him to be president. But we had other candidates. When you add all the votes up for all the other candidates, they were more than what he got. So this idea that it's this, earth-shattering, earthquake-sized mandate is just not true. And I bring that up to let us know we're not alone. I mean, we can find our tribes. We can find our people. And I find that one of the best ways for me to manage Facebook, for example, which I love. I remember distinctly when I discovered Facebook, and I was living in a place far away from where I grew up, and I was able to touch base with my old friends, and I just thought it was the most wonderful thing ever, that I could do that. My old high school buddies, there they are, But my way of coping now is to spend more time in the groups that I'm in, so I have that sense of community, and not let the algorithm just spoon feed me things and me take all that in. I see them and I just scroll. So I think that's a good thing. I do love to know that people are keeping up with current events, but I also am very empathetic to the fact that right now some people just can't, and I get that. I think we have to just, as you said, a fire hose of things is coming at us. And so sometimes the best thing to do is just take a little cover and let the dust settle a little bit and then emerge and see where we are.
Not to make a plane crash reference. I guess that's what I'm about to do. But, they tell you to put your own safety mask on before you help someone else.
Exactly.
And so, people, every once in a while, you got to take a step back and focus on yourself. And people should do that when they feel overwhelmed. And then eventually come back to the fight. I
agree. And I will say that, I am the type that there will be the day that will come, I'm sure, where I will be marching because that's just how I can express myself, and I'm comfortable doing that sort of thing. But I recognize everyone is not. So I really suck at making signs. So when I get ready to march, if I have artistic friends who can serve in that way, I will carry the sign. So that might be good because when I go to march, my sign looks like a third grader made it, or not even a third grader, a 3-year-old actually. Well, thank you so much, Laura Brown. Our show notes are going to have everything that you need to know about how to get in touch with Laura. Check out her website, get some books for your kids and grandkids. And then some tips about on her website about how to keep some sanity in what we're going on now. She has a great website. It's very robust. I've looked at it several times. I want to thank you so much for being here on Blue Lift. We do truly believe that every voice matters. Now, I may not agree with every voice. But, I'm willing to have pretty much every voice on this podcast. So if somebody's sitting there listening to this, I don't know why you'd be listening to it if you disagree with everything that I stand for. But if that's you and you want to come sit at the table and let's have a debate, well, you just come on. Just shoot me an email and we can do that for sure. Thank you so much, Laura. I hope you have a really good afternoon and keep DC heading in the right direction for us. And
doing what I can.
There you go. And we will see everyone next week on Blue Lift, where every voice matters.